Lincoln Castle attracts over 250,000 visitors each year. They come for the stunning views over the city, to pose for photos on ancient stone walls, to soak up centuries of history in one of England's most iconic strongholds. But this place wasn't just built for beauty. For almost 1,000 years, Lincoln Castle was a fortress of control, a place of power, punishment, and execution. Within these walls, men and women took their final steps. Some were met with silence, others with crowds so vast the hillside trembled beneath them. What remains today is not just a castle, but a witness, to lives lost, to justice dealt, and sometimes to questions that were never truly answered. In this episode, we're stepping back into the darkest corners of the past to uncover 4 grim and true stories from Lincoln Castle's history. Each one a thread in the tapestry of crime, consequence, and what it means to face the final judgment.
Hello friends, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Claire, this is the Wanderlust Way. Today's adventure is bringing us to Lincoln, where we're looking into some of the historic executions that took place here. 4 executions in total. I'm going to tell you each individual story. Some of these are really important in British history, and some of them are going to leave you with some unanswered questions. Pretty sad, one of them in particular. However, we have to tell these stories, don't we? Because it's all part of our history. So firstly, before we start this, let me say a huge thank you as always to everybody that supports the channel by liking, commenting, subscribing and sharing, and especially thank you to those who are members and those who send super thanks on the videos. It's really appreciated, and it allows me to continue with these stories, these adventures and all that sort of thing to share on the channel with you. So are you ready for some dark, grim history? I think you might be, if you're still watching. So pull up a chair, that's enough waffle, let's wander. Now behind me is what is known as Cobb Hall, which looks quite nice today. It's even got a bit of a dragon outside of it. But in the summer of 1859, this was a place where thousands gathered, and they gathered not for celebration or to have a picnic, they gathered for death. Because on that day, 2 men were led to the scaffold. And what happened next would mark the end of a very grisly history in Lincoln.
It began as so many of these stories do, in a pub. March 1859, a small alehouse called the Ship Inn, nestled in the hamlet of Sibsby Northlands, echoed with the sound of low laughter and clinking glasses. Among the drinkers were William Stevenson, a 65-year-old farm labourer, and 2 younger men, Henry Carey and William Pickett, both barely into their 20s. When Stevenson left that night, his pockets held just a few shillings, and his killers, they followed. They waited until the road was dark, and then they struck. A vicious, senseless attack. His skull was crushed. The coins were taken, and the 2 men disappeared into the night, leaving the old man's body broken in a roadside ditch. Their freedom didn't last long though. Carey and Pickett were quickly arrested, their guilt as obvious as the blood on their hands. At trial they turned on each other, bickering, blaming, denying. But the jury saw straight through them, and the sentence was clear: death by hanging.
And so on the morning of the 5th of August 1859, the people of Lincoln gathered to see justice unfold.
They came by the thousands, pressed against the castle walls, spilling onto the slopes of Castle Hill, children on shoulders, women gripping handkerchiefs. Cobb Hall had been fitted with a scaffold on its rooftop, high, visible, built to be seen. This was the theatre of justice, and the crowd, whether they admitted it or not, came for the spectacle. Carey and Pickett were led up the steps by the executioner Thomas Askin, flanked by guards. A second man stood by assisting, a cobbler from Horncastle named William Marwood. He was unknown then, but within a few years he'd become one of the most feared names in England. At 8 a.m, the trapdoor dropped. One of the men died cleanly. The other twitched and kicked, choking in the morning air while the crowd watched in silence. It was brutal, it was public, and it was the last time that it would happen here. That day marked the final public execution at Lincoln Castle. The government, disturbed by growing calls for reform, would soon move all the hangings behind prison walls. The public stage was closing.
And now a place once where thousands watched and stood in silence sits here quietly with a dragon and quite a nice view. Look at this. Very nice. In 1868, a woman would come through the gates of Lincoln Castle accused of a most terrible crime. She would leave days later in a coffin. Now, she went down in history as the first woman in Britain to be hanged behind closed doors. However, we're almost 150 years later, we are still asking the question, did they hang the wrong person?
Priscilla Biggadike was not what the Victorian press wanted in a murderer. She wasn't wild-eyed or dangerous. She wasn't dramatic. She was a 35-year-old mother of 5, worn down by poverty, bad luck, and allegedly a bad marriage. She lived with her husband Richard Biggadike and their children in a cramped cottage in the village of Stickney. They shared the home with 2 male lodgers. According to neighbours, Priscilla often argued with her husband, and her relationship with one of the lodgers, John Proctor, raised more than a few eyebrows.
On the 30th of September 1868, Richard Biggadike died violently and suddenly. His skin went pale, his body convulsed, and there was no doubt in everybody's mind that he had died of arsenic poisoning.
It didn't take long for suspicion to land at Priscilla's feet. The post-mortem confirmed the poison. A neighbour claimed to have seen her stirring something into a cup, and the fact that she'd blamed Proctor in a panicked outburst only made her look more guilty. He denied everything. There was no evidence against him, but Priscilla, she was arrested within hours.
She stood at trial at Lincoln Castle, and the newspapers soon caught hold of this story. They called her the Stickney poisoner. Now, some said she was heartless, others simply said she was mad.
She maintained her innocence throughout. When the guilty verdict came, she didn't cry. She simply said, "I never harmed my husband." But the judge passed sentence all the same. Death by hanging. Not in public, but within the prison walls. The Capital Punishment Amendment Act had just come into force that year. No more crowds, no more spectacle, just silence and stone.
And so on the 28th of December 1868, Priscilla Biggadike was led to the gallows here at Lincoln Castle.
She wore a simple black dress. Her head was covered. The hangman, Thomas Askin, did his work quickly. The trapdoor fell, and with it Priscilla was gone. She was the first woman in Britain to be hanged in private. Her body was buried in the castle grounds. No ceremony, no headstone, just the initials PB 1868 scratched into the surface of a moss-covered stone. But the story didn't end there.
Now, years later, when the case had faded from public memory, John Proctor was on his deathbed, and he confessed that he was the one who had killed Richard Biggadike, and he had let Priscilla take the blame for his crime, and ultimately she'd hanged for what he did.
The confession was never officially confirmed. Some dismissed it as rumour, others believed every word. But if it was true, then an innocent woman died right here beneath the shadow of Lincoln Castle. And if that's possible, what does it say about the system that sent her to the scaffold?
William Fredrick Horry, or Fred as his friends like to call him, was not your sort of typical career criminal. He was a father, a husband, and he ran a hotel. He was a landlord in Staffordshire. But if you believe the papers, William Fredrick Horry was destroyed by drink, by heartbreak, and by jealousy.
Fred had run a successful inn with his wife Jane, but their marriage had soured. He drank too much, accused her of sleeping with the guests. Jane eventually fled with the children to Fred's family home in Boston, Lincolnshire, and refused to take him back. In January 1872, Fred arrived at the house with a revolver in his pocket. He asked to see his wife. She refused, and with that, he shot her in the chest, killing her instantly in front of her family. He didn't run, he stood over her body and said quietly, "I've done it." It was as simple and as devastating as that.
Now, at William Horry's trial, the defence claimed madness. They blamed his drinking, on his erratic behaviour, and the fact that he had a complete emotional collapse when his family left him.
But the jury wasn't moved. He'd bought the gun, travelled with it, waited. They saw premeditation, not madness. He was sentenced to die. But Fred Horry's execution would be unlike any before it. Up until now, executions had used the short drop, a brutal method that often left prisoners strangling for minutes before death. It was painful, public, and often botched. But William Marwood, a cobbler from Horncastle turned executioner, had a new idea. He believed he could calculate the drop exactly, breaking the prisoner's neck cleanly and instantly. It was a method designed to be quick, precise, and merciful as hanging can be. But Fred Horry would be the first man to test this.
On the 1st of April 1872, William Marwood pulled the lever. The trap fell, Fred dropped, it had worked.
Fred Horry died in a matter of seconds, the first man in Britain to be executed by the long drop method, a method that would soon become the standard. William is buried in a simple grave in the Lucy Tower of Lincoln Castle, but according to reports on the day of his execution, a crowd of over 3,000 people lined the streets in Burslem where he was well liked. An empty coffin was carried by his friends, and the rector of the church gave a sermon describing Fred as being more sinned against than an actual sinner. A permanent memorial was then erected by his Staffordshire friends over the empty grave. I believe it still stands today.
William Marwood would go on to execute 176 people using this method. It brought him both fear and fame, and it started here in Lincoln with a man who killed his wife and ultimately changed the way that Britain executed their criminals. Not everyone who was brought to Lincoln Castle was a hardened criminal. Some of them were just simply young or heartbroken or just a little bit unhinged. And in 1875, a man by the name of Peter Blanchard was brought here for something he did in a moment of rage, a moment of madness, and it would go on to cost him absolutely everything.
Peter Blanchard was just 26 when he was sent to the gallows. A tanner by trade, quiet, religious, but behind the stillness something was cracking. For 4 years he'd courted a young woman named Louisa Hodgson. She was kind, well liked, from a respectable family in Louth. But their relationship was strained. Peter suffered from epilepsy, his moods were erratic, and Louisa's mother made no secret of her disapproval. Eventually Louisa ended it, and on the evening of the 21st of March 1875, Louisa was walking home from chapel with a friend, and Peter was watching. When she stepped inside her house, he followed her in. What happened next lasted less than a minute. A confrontation, raised voices, and then Peter grabbed a butcher's knife from the kitchen table and plunged it into Louisa's chest, piercing her heart. She died in seconds. Peter ran. He turned up at a poultry dealer's house later that night, hands shaking, eyes wild. He confessed immediately to his friend, to the police, to anyone who would ask. "I did it," he said, "and I will die like a man for her."
He awaited for trial at Lincoln Castle, and when the time came, he didn't deny the crime, but he did plea diminished responsibility. Now, he blamed his epilepsy, he blamed his obsession, he blamed his mental instability, and it was said that the judge said that it would bring him no joy in condemning him.
But the law was firm. Peter Blanchard was sentenced to hang. While awaiting execution, he wrote letters, not of protest but of remorse. He wept when he received Louisa's funeral card. He begged to be buried beside her, a request that was of course denied. And in his final message, he warned others not to follow his path. He said, "Keep out of bad company, look to Jesus, or some of you may be standing where I am next year."
On the 9th of August 1875, Peter was brought to the inner walls of the Lincoln Castle to the gallows, and William Marwood, now appointed the official person for the job, he performed the long drop method. At the execution, it was said that Peter died instantly, without any sound or any struggle.
Some called him a cold-blooded killer. Others believed he was simply a broken young man who couldn't cope with loss. Either way, Peter Blanchard's story ended here, in blood, in silence, beside stone.
By the end of the 19th century, Lincoln Castle gallows had fallen silent, with the final execution taking place here in 1877.
Today the castle is a place of learning, of tourism, of light. But walk its perimeter at dawn or linger beneath the shadow of Cobb Hall at dusk, and you might feel something different. A weight in the air, a hush that doesn't quite belong to the present. Because for centuries this place did more than house kings and lords. It bore witness to the very edge of life itself. Some of these stories ended with justice, some ended in doubt, and some, like Priscilla Biggadike, leave us with a question that still echoes through time. In telling these stories, we don't glorify their crimes. We shine a light on the darker side of justice, one that unfolded behind stone walls and iron gates. These walls stood watch over every verdict, every final breath, and they've kept their silence ever since. The rope may be gone, but something lingers.
So, what do you think? Were these executions justice, or were they echoes of a system that sometimes got things wrong? I mean, how about if you hanged the wrong person, for example? So that's the end of this episode. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I'm Claire, this is The Wanderlust Way. Thank you for supporting the channel. If you give it a like or a comment or anything like that, that's really, really helpful. And I will see you on the next episode.